I would like to welcome you to this webinar on preparing for the interview. The interview is an important part of the refugee sponsorship application process, since the decision of the visa officer depends significantly on the outcome of the interview. With that in mind, this webinar will offer some recommendations on how to prepare before the interview and what to do during and after the interview. Okay, so before the interview, how can sponsors help newcomer refugee or sponsored refugees prepare for the interview? Well, one of the things that is really helpful is if sponsors have direct and regular contact with refugee applicants. And helping actually starts at the time of application. You want to document the refugee's information and story accurately and in their own words. Don't correct any grammar or mistakes that you see in the flow of the words. Make sure it's in their own words. It's their story. They need to be able to repeat it during the interview. Ensure that all family members are included in the application and new dependents are added when new marriages, adoptions, or births occur. So good beginnings lead to successful ends. When completing the generic applications, Schedule 2 and Schedule A forms provide accurate, complete information from the refugees in their own words and use translators when necessary. So you want to be informed about the refugee definition. Do they fall under Convention Refugee or do they fall under Country of Asylum class? What are the country conditions in the country of origin? And are the durable solutions available in their country of asylum or other opportunities for resettlement? I want to strongly encourage you to follow the IMM 6000 Guide for Convention Refugees and Humanitarian Protected Persons Abroad. You want to include country condition reports in the application to demonstrate that the refugees do not have a durable solution in their country of origin, they can't return, and also in the country of asylum, why they can't locally integrate there. Make sure that the refugee story includes specific details and dates in their Schedule A and Schedule 2. And always submit updates for any changes in circumstances. Sometimes refugees, due to their situation and need to survive, will be moving from location to location. Make sure if they change the country where they are located or their address where they're living in their country of asylum, that you update IRCC, the visa office. You can notify ROCCO of those changes. In particular, if there are changes to their phone number or their email. And lastly, always work closely with the refugee at all times. It's a best practice to have direct contact with the refugee as much as possible as the sponsorship team. That way, there's no question about the answers that you are giving or that questions they may be asking, and that there's clarity. Here is a slide that is showing you where you can go to find country condition reports. And the best place, I think, is UNHCR. Of course, there's many other places that provide country condition reports. It's a good idea to go look for the country of asylum and the country of origin and download any information that would support the refugee claim, the need for resettlement to Canada. Okay, so before the interview, what is the purpose of the interview? Because the interview is an important part of the refugee sponsorship application process, The visa officer needs to determine if the refugee is eligible. Do they fall under Convention Refugee or Country of Asylum class definition? Are they outside of their country of origin? And do they have a durable solution or not for local integration? They're also trying to determine if they're admissible. That would be considered unlawful in Canada. Are they a danger to the public health of Canadians? And so do they have a communicable disease? There are some other things that are investigated, like military service, to determine if they're admissible. But just having participated in the military does not mean that you would not be admissible to Canada. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And finally, the final purpose of the interview is to determine whether resettlement solution given the refugee applicant's situation. So before the interview, you want to review forms and documents. The sponsored refugees should carefully review copies of all application forms and supporting documents that were submitted to the IRCC. If you do not have copies of your application package, please let your sponsors know immediately so they can help you obtain them. When reviewing the application forms and supporting documents, you will want to make note of anything that may not be true, or if anything is missing, or if there is new information to be added since the time of your application. Before the interview, you want to confirm the position is correct. In the application forms, all your family members should be mentioned, whether or not they will be accompanying you to Canada, including those who are missing, those whose whereabouts are unknown, or who may be presumed to be dead. You must include your spouse or common law partner, any unmarried dependent children who are under the age of 22, any of your dependents' children who are under the age of 22. If you notice that some of your family members are missing on the generic application, please inform your sponsors and the visa office quickly when you think about questions to ask yourself. Have we adopted any children since the time of application? Has anybody gotten married? Has anybody gone missing or deceased? Is there a new baby? Is there any medical condition that has arisen since the time of application? Or even before the application, maybe you didn't realize you should mention medical conditions. Medical conditions are important because they may provide a compelling reason to expedite the application. That's a rare case when that happens, but certainly if somebody is very ill and in need of resettlement, and being resettled to Canada can help them with their medical condition, that is taken into consideration. So it's really good to include medical conditions in your application. And if you didn't at the time of application, send an update so that the visa officer knows you have a family member who is in urgent need of medical care. And lastly, you want to let your sponsors know if anybody's pregnant. They'll welcome a new baby, but they also need to add that infant onto the application when they are born. Okay, you also want to confirm the refugee family's contact information is correct. Number and email address for how to reach you as the refugee is correct. This is the information that the visa office will invite you for the interview. Before the interview, you also want to update the refugee family's personal history or refugee story. Again, I mentioned Refugees may have relocated to another place since the time of application. They may have experienced additional persecution. They may have more to add to their refugee story. Look for any mistakes in the forms and encourage the refugees to be sure to inform you so you can assist them with updating the application forms that have been submitted to IRCC. Verify all supporting documents have been included. Before the interview, you want to provide all available documents, of course, that are relevant to your case. Some examples: news articles, letters, statements from friends and family, police reports, medical reports, etc. Documents showing what happened to other people who faced a situation similar to yours. For example, relatives who were recognized as refugees. Personal identification documents, such as passports, ID cards, refugee documents, if they are available. And proof documents for marriage, divorce, birth, death, or baptism certificates. You also want to include status documents. All documents and letters issued to you by the UNHCR or the government of the country where you are currently living. Documents showing your problems in the country where you are currently living, and documents showing compelling medical and/or psychological problems, such as a doctor's report, medical condition reports, etc. So it's important to remember details, time, dates, and location of events that happen to your family. Know your refugee story. Keep in mind that one of the most common reasons for rejection is inconsistency. The story is not the same. That occurs when facts are given at the interview are different from the information provided in the application forms. This is why it's so important when you document or assisting the refugee with completing their forms, let them speak and just translate what they're saying into the document word for word in their own words. You can help to clarify what information they're putting into the document, but they need to write down the information in their own words. Sponsored refugees applicants should carefully read their personal refugee story that is on Schedule 2, Refugees Outside of Canada form. Make sure that all events that happen to you and your family are true and accurate. Make a list of important make a list of important details regarding the time, date, and location of the events that happen to your family and persons or organizations associated with your situation and story, as you may forget these details during the interview. Practice the interview in advance with someone you trust. This is where your sponsors will be valuable helpers to you. They'd be happy to have you practice your interview with them. The person can ask you questions about your life in your home country and the reason why you had to flee. If you notice mistakes in your personal refugee story, or you believe that some of the relevant events, incidents, or dates are missing, please inform the visa office and your sponsor about this prior to the interview. If you would like to add information about relevant events that happened to you or members of your family, which are not already mentioned in your personal story, please inform the visa office and your sponsors in writing immediately. Now, if you are submitting through a sponsorship agreement holder, it's important to let them know first, and they will inform the visa office for you. They really need to know any information and updates so they can prepare for you to arrive and that they are ready for any changes that might happen. So sponsors may support and encourage refugee applicants to share new information and updates. Tell the truth. It's really best to be honest. Ask to be rescheduled if the date and time of the interview are difficult. Ask to be interviewed separately as necessary. Now, I want to talk a little bit about asking to be interviewed separately. You know, when someone experiences abuse, whether it's sexual or non-sexual, they're able to talk about it in the presence of their husband or wife or children. These experiences are very difficult to talk about. And there may also be issues of cultural shame, a fear of burdening their family, or a fear of stigma. So it's really important, if you feel the need to be interviewed separately for these reasons, you can ask to be interviewed separately about those things from your family, and the visa officer will maintain that privacy for you. Oh, I think I went a little too far here. Let me just go back one. Okay, I'm just going to stay on this slide, but I'll be talking about the other points from the previous slide. Okay, when working with interpreters, being comfortable with the language is not the only thing you need to flag with them. To the visa officer if there is any conflict of interest. You want to share information with the visa officer for anything that might impact the interview. For example, let's say you're sick and you won't be able to attend. They need to know right away. If anybody on the application has gone missing, has been deported or detained, members of your family that are on your application, they need to know about that information. And if you have difficulty traveling to the interview location, you need to ask what your options are. And ask for clarification if you do not understand anything. Okay, you will receive a notification of interview, and applicants are invited to an interview at the visa office abroad, usually by phone or by email. So that's why it's very important to submit current contact information. You don't want to miss that call. You don't want to miss that email notifying you of the date and time. And very important, do not miss the interview. You should always arrive at specified location on the date and time given to you, and you should not be late. During the interview, you'll be interviewed by a Canadian visa officer. The Canadian visa officer is only reviewing your information for the purpose of determining if you are eligible and admissible to Canada. The information you share will not be disclosed outside of the Canadian government, and only those who have a necessity to work with your information will be allowed to see that information. You can feel confident that you don't have to fear what the visa officer might be sharing outside of the Canadian government. If you've requested an interpreter, the interpreter will also be in the room with you and the visa officer. The visa officer will ask you about the nature and causes of your personal refugee story and the current situation in your home country and the country you are currently living in. For example, they will ask, why did you leave your home country? Why can't you go back? Why can you not stay where you are? And you may also be asked about your education, work, experience, family life, French and English skills, your knowledge of Canada, and motivation to settle there. So what do I bring to the interview? Well, you want to be sure to bring the original documents in your possession, such as a copy of the submitted application forms, original photos, and you'll want to make sure that you get new ones if they are older than 6 months. You also want to bring original supporting documents, identification documents for you and all family members included in your application, documents that can support your refugee story and your fear of persecution at home. If you bring new documents to the interview, ones that you were not able to submit to the visa office beforehand, you will need to explain to the visa officer why you could not provide them prior to the interview. If any of your documents are not in English or French, please make sure you bring a translated copy. If you do not have any of the required documents, please be prepared to explain to the visa officer the reasons why you do not have them. For example, your passport might be expired. You maybe had to flee and were not able to take any documentation with you at all. That's okay. You just need to explain to the visa officer the reasons why you do not have them. So how do I conduct myself during the interview? Well, for one thing, do not be afraid of the visa officer who will conduct the interview. Answer all questions to the best of your knowledge and ability and give answers that are clear and straight and to the point. You want to be truthful. You should trust the visa officer and give complete and truthful answers to their questions. If you did not understand the question, don't be shy. Ask the visa officer to repeat or rephrase this question for you. It's really important not to exaggerate your story, to tell more about your story that might make it sound more stressful, more dire than it actually is. You should only tell the truth, even if it sounds too simple. Remember that providing false, fabricated, or embellished information may result in your application being rejected. Do not hide information from the visa officer. Remember, I talked about how the military service that you may have participated in, it is part of the decision for admissibility, but not all of those who served in the military are automatic. There are many factors to decide whether or not someone is inadmissible to Canada on the basis of that service. It depends on the hierarchy structure of that military governance, the consequences, the duress you were under. Maybe you were conscripted and forced to go. Was there draft evasion? Did you participate in armed conflicts? So there's a lot involved in the decision making. And so I encourage you to provide all of your military documentation and let the visa officer make the determination, because I have had experience where someone had submitted their military service and they thought for sure it was going to make them inadmissible to come to Canada. And in fact, they were allowed to come because their military service was under duress. They were conscripted and they had no choice but to be a part of the military. So that actually helped their application because they told the truth. You want to make sure that you tell the visa officer if there's been any change in your family composition. If you recently got married or had a child, you need to let the visa officer know. If you do not declare your new family members, they may never be allowed to join you in Canada later on. Now, this is something that's really important. You want to let your sponsors know. Your sponsors are preparing for your arrival and your family to come to Canada, and they really don't want to have any last-minute surprises. If they have saved up money to support you as an individual and you got married, that's okay. They won't be upset that you got married. They just want to know ahead of time so they can prepare and make sure they have sufficient funds for when you come to Canada. If you are nervous, upset, or need a break during the interview, do not be shy or afraid to ask the visa officer for a break. You have the right to ask questions. Ask questions at the start of the interview about the purpose of the interview, the role of the visa officer and the interpreter, if they're available, and the format of the interview. Ask for an interpreter or for a different interpreter, whether it be male or female, as needed. Ask to be separately interviewed if needed. Remember, it's okay to speak to the visa officer on your own, apart from your family members, for telling important facts about your personal persecution, things that you endured and you overcame, but will be really important for you to share so they understand why you need to be resettled in Canada. You can also ask if you need a break. If you are feeling confused or really nervous and you just need a moment to catch your breath and calm your heart rate, that's okay. You can ask. Just say, "Can I take a moment, please? I just need a break to collect myself." You can also ask what happens after the interview. And you want to tell the interviewer everything. Do not assume that the visa officer knows something that is obvious to you, especially when it comes to certain traditions and cultural distinctions. You should carefully explain everything that you want the visa officer to know. If you have family members who are also a part of the application, make sure you also talk about any risks of danger that they would face if returned to their home country. This also includes risks to your spouse, common law partner, and children. If you've submitted supporting documents, you can remind the visa officer of these documents and point out how they support your story. And lastly, do not leave the interview without saying everything that you wanted to tell the visa officer. All of the dangers that you faced or may face if you return home or stay in the country of asylum. So I want to share some tips for you about the interview that you may not know about. It's really important to maintain eye contact, unless, of course, it's culturally offensive for you to do so. Did you know the visa officer is only associated with the Canadian government? Information is only used for assessing the permanent resident application. The interpreter is impartial and they play no role in decision making. And no question should be answered until it's fully understood. Ask for clarification. You can do that. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about working with an interpreter. If you do not speak French or English, interpreters can assist you during the interview. It's good to have an interpreter when English is your second language. Make sure that you understand the interpreter and the interpreter can understand you. Answer all questions clearly and break each answer into short parts so the interpreter is able to translate every word you say. Now remember, interpreters are not allowed to summarize your answer or omit any parts of your answer. They must interpret your answer fully and accurately. When working with an interpreter, if they do not speak exactly the same language or dialect as you, resulting in misunderstanding. The role of the interpreter is to help you and the visa officer understand each other. Tell the visa officer right away when you have a concern about the interpretation. You can ask for an interpreter that is the same gender as you. This is particularly important if you do not feel comfortable about sharing the details of your personal refugee story with an interpreter because of their gender. For example, if you're a female and the interpreter is male, or vice versa, you should politely inform the visa officer and ask for an interpreter that is the same gender as you. Do not be afraid to speak up, speak truthfully in front of the interpreter, regardless of their religious, cultural, or ethnic background. The role of the interpreter is to help you and the visa officer understand each other. The interpreter cannot influence the decision of the visa officer. If you think the interpreter made a mistake or omitted some of the information, misquotes you, or misunderstands what you have said to them, tell the visa officer immediately. Do not be shy or afraid to interrupt the interpreter and correct them. Most importantly, do not wait until the end of the interview to tell the visa officer that you think the interpreter made mistakes or that they misunderstood what you said. You should tell them right when it's happening. If you are convinced that the interpreter provided to you is not doing a good job, please inform the visa officer immediately. Do not wait till the end of the interview. Okay, during the interview, the visa officer will ask open and closed-ended questions. They're going to verify your family composition, information in your permanent residence application, and check for any updates. They'll ask questions on the refugee definition and on durable solutions. They're going to ask if there is anything to be added to the application. They will have you sign for a travel loan if it's applicable and may provide instructions on medical testing. Sometimes you don't receive instructions on medical testing at the time of interview. That will occur later. That's why it's also important to make sure that you provide current and accurate phone numbers and emails where you can be contacted. The visa officer will also check if there are problems with communication. If you do not speak French or English, the interpreters can assist you during the interview. It's a good thing to have the interpreter when English is your second language. So the role of the interpreter. They interpret word for word. They notify if there are any communication problems. So for example, if the interpreter does not speak exactly the same language or dialect as you do, and this causes misunderstanding, you or the interpreter should politely inform the visa officer and arrange for another interpreter immediately. You want to notify the visa officer if you have concerns with the interviewer of possible conflict of interest. Do they actually know you? Might that cause their interpretation to be biased? Now, the interpreter may explain to the interview culture. You have a gesture, a movement of your hands, or, you know, the way you hold your head or move your head, the interpreter may just simply explain to the visa officer what those symbols mean. So if you have a nod of the head in your culture, meaning yes, translate that you acknowledge that you said yes. They are going to maintain impartiality, culturally sensitive. They'll maintain confidentiality and privacy. And it's very important that the interpreter and the person being interviewed, the refugee applicant, do not engage in side discussions. The visa officer should always be the one being responded to. Look directly at the visa officer. So after the interview, when will I learn about the decision? The visa officer may make the decision and share it with you actually at the end of the interview. However, in most cases, they may need more time to make the decision. If after the interview you obtain any new documents, please immediately submit them to the visa office and your sponsors. If you think something went wrong during the interview, for example, you forgot to mention some important facts, please inform the visa office and your sponsors in writing immediately. It is also recommended that right after the interview, you prepare a summary of your interview, starting with the time you entered the building. List the questions that you were asked and the answers that you gave. That way, if you get a refusal to your application and you have some concerns with what happened at any point from the time you entered the building, maybe you encountered somebody that you know who is against you on your way to the interview, and that caused you to have fear, and you weren't as open with your answers as you wished you were, then you should notify the visa officer at the time of the interview. But if you didn't, you have that documented in case there is a refusal letter received. So we have common challenges that the visa officers encounter when working with the cases and the applications for privately sponsored refugees. The family composition. When the interview happens, there's a difference between reality and the information in the permanent residence application. So in your application, you indicated you were a single person. When you come to the interview, the visa officer sees you have a wife and 2 children. That's an inconsistency, and that's a challenge for the visa officer because it demonstrates the possibility that you were not being truthful at the time of application, and it may call into question the credibility of your application. Establishing family links. There's a lack of supporting documents to prove that your children are your children and not somebody else's children. There's a lack of supporting documents to prove that your spouse is your spouse, that you were married. There is a lack of supporting documents to demonstrate that you have care and control over a relative's children who the relative may have passed away and they may be fully financially dependent upon you. You always need to provide supporting documents to prove those things as much as possible. For one-year window applications, submitting applications for ineligible family members happens often. In order to be able to submit a one-year window application, you have to have named your relatives, your family members on your generic application at the time you submitted it. So what that means is if your spouse and your dependent children are in a country where they can't leave at the same time as you to come to Canada when you're approved, you can make an application in your first year in Canada to have them sponsored to come to Canada. And they will go through the process of coming to Canada. Unfortunately, if you did not name them on your generic application and undertaking at the time of application, it's a very serious thing. You may never be able to have them come to Canada. It's important to name all family members on your application. That way they will be eligible for a 1-year window when they are non-accompanying. De facto dependence. The dependency cannot be established. So, for example, if your sister passed away and you are taking care of her little child who is 3 years old, has nobody else to take care of that little child, and you're financially and emotionally caring for that little 3-year-old, you have to be able to demonstrate that this is your sister's child, that there is a relationship, and that you have a history of being financially responsible. And so some of the documentation proofs that you could provide are statements from family members, statements from friends who know that you've been looking after that little child since your sister passed away. Another challenge is communication. When you change your contact information and you don't notify the visa office and they can't reach you, if they're trying to contact you for your interview or for additional information that is important for them making their decision, they need to be able to reach you and you need to be able to respond quickly. When they contact you, they give you a timeline of when you need to respond. You should respond right away. They need to have these answers in order to make a positive decision. Interviews and documents. Visa officers receive fraudulent documents and people who don't show up to the interview. Fraudulent documents, these are documents that perhaps might be a UNHCR refugee status certificate that is not real, that was not issued by the UNHCR. Somebody made one up. You want to make sure that you're not submitting fraudulent documents. The visa officer has an understanding of what is a real document and what is fraudulent, and you want to be truthful. So don't submit fraudulent documents, and always show up for your interview or notify the visa officer if for some reason you are unable to attend so they can reschedule. The background and personal history. You're not being forthright or you fail to provide information at the time of interview when you are asked direct questions. When it comes to eligibility, the basis of the claim in the application forms may be inconsistent with what the application states or what the applicant says at the time of interview. Your application story must be the visa officer at the time of interview. That's why it's really important to review what was written down in your application before you go into the interview. Take notes, make a list to help you remember. It's okay to bring that list with you to the interview. Information provided is inconsistent with the country of origin information or country of asylum. So if you provided statements in your story about persecution that is happening in your country of origin or country of asylum, and it's not provable, you have no documentation to support it, then they will have a challenge with finding you eligible for sponsorship under the refugee definition. Establishing identity and lack of documentation. Again, fraudulent documents and identity replacement occurs sometimes, and this is a challenge for visa officers because the credibility of the applicant is called into question when they provide documents that are false and misleading. And registration. The applicant has resettled in another country. So you may be in a country of asylum that is dangerous for you, and you decide to move your family to try and be in a safer location. You must notify the visa officer. It will impact the progress of your application because your file has to be transferred to another visa officer for review and making the decision. Always notify your sponsors and the visa officer if you move to another country of asylum. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about reasons for refusals. Okay, the reasons for refusals quite often is based on credibility. The basis of claim by the applicant on their form does not match the story at the interview. Information does not match the country of origin conditions, or they're totally making up an identity or claim. So credibility means that they don't fully believe your story because the details, the times and dates and places that you're naming at the interview don't coincide with what's written on the application. You may be telling a story about when you were persecuted, and you include names of people that you didn't include in your application story. And so adding new information at the time of interview is not helpful. It actually may call into question your credibility. And so you want to make sure that you always include dates, names, places, times of every event, include the names of people who were involved. That's important to establish that you are telling the truth. And for eligibility, this is related to your status or the availability of durable solutions other than resettlement to Canada. For example, you might not meet the refugee definition, or you may have durable solutions that have been offered to you already. For example, if you have an application, a private sponsorship application to come to Canada, but you've also got a UNHCR application in, and UNHCR offered you to go to Australia, or they offered you to go to the United States, and you refused for invalid reasons, this could be seen as you gave up the opportunity for a durable solution, and the visa officer may actually decide that you had a durable solution that you didn't make use of. And that comes down to what is the best solution for you given your circumstances. And admissibility. And this is based on any security concerns. Again, security concerns would be, have you committed a crime that would be considered unlawful in Canada? Now, visa officers understand that when you are in a refugee situation, you make desperate decisions for your family, and that actually is part of your refugee story. Be truthful, because some of that actually strengthens your story. They will evaluate whether the crime you committed is actually something that will put the Canadian public in danger. They're trying to determine whether this was an act of survival or whether it was something that was unlawful, had intention, and you had served time for, and that in Canada you may continue that criminal activity. And so again, it is very important to be truthful and honest about anything that would be called into question about your application. You want to make sure you set yourself up for success by being truthful. And non-compliance. The visa office cannot contact the applicant to proceed with the application. So they have sent you an interview request. They've sent an email asking for additional documentation, and they gave you a timeline of responding within 30 days, sometimes 2 weeks, and you did not send them the information they're asking for within the time frame they gave you. And so that means you are not compliant with the process and they can't proceed with your application. Okay, we're going to talk about receiving a refusal letter. Of course, nobody wants to receive a refusal letter. We are all hopeful that we will receive a positive decision. However, in some cases, you may receive a refusal letter. And you need to know that you have some options available to you when that happens. You have just 60 days from the date you receive the refusal letter to initiate something called a judicial review, which we will talk about in a little bit. So it's important to know that you want to contact your sponsors right away, and you want to perhaps get some legal advice as to how to proceed before you make any response, and know that there is a fixed amount of time that you can make those claims. So copies of the refusal letter are often sent to both the sponsor and the applicant, but sometimes they aren't. So if you received the refusal letter, don't be afraid to contact your sponsors and let them know. Give them a copy of the refusal letter so they can help you determine if there's anything at all you can do to pursue legal advice on whether or not you could have your case looked at for new information. If a privately sponsored refugee has been refused and you want to better understand the reasons for refusal, the first step is for the sponsors to review the refusal letter. The letter explains why the officer was not satisfied that the applicant met the requirements for resettlement to Canada. You may also wish to ask the applicant to describe any concerns the officer expressed at the interview. And as sponsors, you should familiarize yourself with the eligibility and admissibility guidelines. They may also help you understand how the officer came to their decision. Now, sometimes in the process, you will receive a procedural fairness letter. This happens just before a refusal letter is received. This is when a decision is leaning towards a refusal, and because of procedural fairness, which is in the Refugee Act, the visa officer is giving you their concerns and an opportunity to provide new information to alleviate those concerns so they may reconsider their decision that they're leaning towards. It's important to know that it is on the applicant to provide all relevant evidence and information that they have at their disposal to support the application at the time of the initial interview. You must provide all relevant evidence and information so that the visa officer can make an informed decision. Okay, some options following a refusal. You have two options. The first is an informal review of refusals. Applicants whose cases have been refused can write to the visa office, the Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, or the minister requesting a review of their refusal decision. Now, it's advisable to seek legal counsel prior to requesting the informal review of refusals. And in fact, if you receive a procedural fairness letter, it's a good idea to consult a a lawyer who has experience in immigration, in particular refusals, so that the letter and the requests that are being sent are formed from a legal perspective. You may decide that you don't agree with the decision, and you may say, I don't agree in your refusal letter or to your procedural fairness. That's not enough of a new information being presented that the visa officer will take into consideration. And lawyers have the knowledge about what can be requested or explained, or new information that may have been overlooked, or any new information that was not available or that can be added to the information for the application. And when it comes to the judicial review of refusals, the PSR refugee applicant who is refused can seek leave for judicial review before the Federal Court of Canada. Now, that's a lot of information that may not make sense, but basically it means that the Federal Court of Canada can take a look at the process and the way that things moved with your application. Anything related to process that may have impeded or framed the decision to become a refusal rather than an approval, that Court of Canada can request that the case be reopened. It can't overturn the decision of the visa officer. The visa officer has the full authority to maintain their decision. However, the case may be reopened and new information or perhaps another interview may be ordered, and that will give the visa officer an opportunity to examine that new information. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. At this time, I would like to see if anybody has any questions. So maybe what I'll do is start with Sunit. Is there anything coming from the written questions that you maybe want to read out, and I'll do my best to answer?
Yes, so thank you to everybody who sent their questions in. If you did send a question in using the question box, please do open up that box, because I have been responding to your questions by text throughout the webinar. So if you don't hear your question read out during this Q&A portion, it's most likely because we provided a written response to that question in the question box. So please review the question box, and the responses to all of the questions that came in were sent to all participants, so everybody should be able to see the question as well as our response. We'll read a couple of questions out just because they have been asked repeatedly by a few attendees. The first one is, could you please clarify that it's okay for the refugee family to bring in their notes or some dates or key names on a piece of paper with them at the time of the interview?
Yes, absolutely. You have the right to bring information that will help you explain to the visa officer your story. And so it would be good to notify the visa officer that you have done so for the reason that you don't want to miss out key information, that you might be nervous and forget things during the interview. And so you'll be referring to your notes before you make responses to ensure they have the full information that you want to give to them. And so bringing the application with you, the original application, so you can take a look at that before answering to refresh your memory. Excuse me, just let the visa officer know what you are referring to and why.
Great, so I hope that answers your questions, those of you that sent that question in. A couple of other attendees are asking, is this webinar being recorded? And will a recording of the webinar be shared at a later date?
Yes, absolutely. I'm hoping the recording worked. So I will definitely send a follow-up email later on, which will include a link to the webinar, as well as some attachments. I guess at this point in time, I should mention to you, I have included 3 handouts for you that you are able to download, and the information basically that was presented in this webinar is available to you in a document called Preparing for Interview. And so the interview prep fact sheet is available in multiple languages. And so what I've done is I've provided a PDF document called Preparing for Interview Quick Links. If you open that document, it gives you some links that will take you to RSTP website. And it also has quick links to those multiple language versions of preparing for the interview fact sheet. And then I've also included All About Refusals fact sheet. And all of these documents, except for the quick links document, are available on our website. If you go to rstp.ca and you go under the, I think it's the resources menu item, you can scroll down to fact sheets and you can access these PDF documents. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit of a side track there. Are there any more questions, Sunit?
No, that's great. That ties in perfectly to the next question, which was how do we disseminate this info to the refugees that the sponsors attending are sponsoring? So as Serena mentioned, this information is available in multiple languages on the RSTP website, either through the resources tab or under the refugees tab. If you go to the refugees tab, you'll see an option of preparing for the interview.
Great. Thank you so much, Sunit. I appreciate it. Also wanted to mention that if you have case-specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm sure Sunit would as well. But if you're a sponsor here in Canada, I think it's really important for you to contact your local RSTP trainer, the one who is within your province, because they can give you much more quicker response than potentially Sunit and I could if all 100 of you who had registered were to ask us questions. It would take us a long time. And so we want to spread the workload around with our colleagues on the RSTP staff team. And so to find your local RSTP trainer, you can go to the rstp.ca website, look under contacts, and you can find the trainer that is operating in your region. For those sponsored refugees who have joined us today, I want to thank you so much. I appreciate that you have taken the time to learn how to prepare well for your interview. I want to advise you to contact your sponsors if you have any questions, additional questions, or you need more assistance. Your sponsors are the best resource for getting information to you, and they will contact us at rstp.ca if they don't know the answer. If all refugees were to contact us from around the world, we would never be able to get any work done. So again, we spread some of the workload around, and your sponsors truly are trained and informed to help